So I want to say a little bit about how Plato and Aristotle differed in relationship to each other and to their take on art. Interestingly, while Plato himself, at least according to his own account, was a poet before Socrates convinced him to become a philosopher, Plato's student, Aristotle, was more scientifically minded, but from that scientific mindset he actually found a value for art in society that Plato didn't see. So we remember that for Plato, ideas such as a horse or a human are the kind of things that make the object possible. Aristotle wants to exactly reverse this and say, we only have the idea of a horse because there are real horses in the world, and when we look at the horses in the world, we say, oh, horses have nice long ears, strong legs, pointy snout, and manes. And so we get the idea of the horse for Aristotle from the real horses themselves. So for Plato, the existence of the horse, that there are horses at all, is only possible because the idea of the horse already exists. And the more horse-like the real horse is, the better that horse is. Aristotle is going to say that there's no such thing as an idea of a horse or a form of a horse that's separate from just what horses have in common. So the idea that we have is taken from the form of a horse in a very ordinary sense, really. It's just the form that horses in fact come in. The form doesn't exist, the idea doesn't exist as some separate thing, except when we think of it from abstracting from the many horses that we see. Aristotle also makes the claim that we can learn from earthly things. Aristotle himself was a scientist when Alexander the Great, who he had tutored, Aristotle had, as a child, was going around the world conquering various lands. He actually sent specimens back to Aristotle to study, and Aristotle did a lot of some of the very earliest biological classification, some of the very earliest physics, biology, study of plants and other physical systems, physics even. And so Aristotle believed that, unlike Plato, who said you can only really learn from ignoring the corrupt physical world, Aristotle believed that we can learn a lot from just looking at the things around us, because that rational structure exists in the things themselves. So Aristotle was a big fan of actually studying nature, looking at nature closely and focusing on nature to learn from nature itself. Somewhere Aristotle gives the example of an acorn, and the idea that the acorn contains in itself the logical structure to create the mighty oak. So that logical structure, or the idea, if you will, the form of the oak tree, exists in the oak seed itself, not in some magical or otherworldly way, but just in the form of the seed. It's somehow within the seed itself, the ability to generate the oak tree. Thinking specifically about art, Aristotle makes the point that art can actually help us to learn. For example, painting copies of nature helps us to learn about nature. Especially before we had photographic reproduction, most textbooks that were teaching us how to understand nature did that by representing nature through painting or drawing. Drama was also really important in ancient Greece, and Aristotle makes the point that drama copies human nature to help us learn about human nature. So, where Plato would have seen a film like American Beauty, which is a bad person doing mostly bad things. In fact, almost every character is bad people doing mostly bad things. And Plato would have worried, well, these characters, though evil, are sympathetic, and it teaches you to have sympathy for evil people. We shouldn't have this kind of drama. Aristotle would say, well, no, if we watch the characters who are doing the wrong thing, and we understand their motivation for doing the wrong thing, we can learn something about our own character, our own tendencies, our own proclivities toward doing the wrong thing. We can understand why the character made bad choices, and we can learn from that to actually make good choices. So even watching bad people do bad things, if it's represented in a way that's believable, we can learn from that ideas about how to ourselves be virtuous. Aristotle also makes the point that some kinds of art, such as tragedy, which oftentimes shows the worst people doing the worst kinds of things, not only teach us not to do those things, but also provide for us a kind of experience which he refers to as catharsis. So catharsis is an experience that people have when they witness very negative events. But they're events that are not actually happening to them, right? They're events that are just represented, especially through something like tragedy. Oedipus is a good example of this because Oedipus is abandoned as a child. He ends up marrying his mother and killing his father. And whereas Plato would be horrified at the very idea of us watching such a story, Aristotle thinks that when we see these horrible things like sexuality and violence represented in a dramatic way, that we somehow experience a purgation of our fears, anxiety, and antisocial emotions. So the anger and the fear and the sexual frustration that's built up in us by having to live as good citizens, right? Good citizens can't be expressing their fear, anger, and sexual feelings anytime they occur. So it builds up in us on this view, and watching something like a tragedy can actually sort of, as we feel with the character, kind of empty us of those negative emotions and allow us to keep living as good citizens without that antisocial emotion building up. If it seems like sort of a Freudian idea, you're right. Freud takes the idea of catharsis, definitely derivatively of Aristotle's concept of catharsis as it exists in ancient philosophy.